All right, friends, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Ryan. I'm the Executive Director here at Comal Conservation, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I know it's spring break. I know it's St. Patty's Day. I'm so glad to see the sea of green. It's amazing. By the way, we've got green shirts in the back. If you're not wearing green, you feel inclined. All of the money from the merch goes to the cause, so thank you for being here. I also want to give some kudos out tonight. I want to give kudos to the Cookie Queen, Leslie Day, in the back. Leslie brings snacks, and always fantastic. I want to thank Brandy for manning the merch table and for our live stream, which is kind of terrifying, but I'm glad that she's on it. I also want to thank Scott, our videographer. He's here all the time. Thank you for being here. And I also, I just have to shout out to my wife, Katie, wherever you are. I don't know. Oh, there you are. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to do this work without Katie. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I also want, if you're a board member at Comal Conservation, if you'd raise your hand real quick. Man, let's give a round of applause for all the folks who have worked so hard to bring these programs to y'all, and I'm grateful for them and all their efforts. So I've got a couple of announcements before we kick things off. The first big announcement that I have is that we recently received a grant, which is wonderful. Round of applause for that. Whenever Comal Conservation gets grants, it's always a good thing. And this money is going to go towards our Texas Children in Nature Network Hill Country, which is a regional collaborative to connect our children with the great outdoors. So absolutely wonderful. I also want to mention on the tables in the back, we've got these wonderful QR codes. We've got a new volunteer portal. So you can use your phone, you can log in, and you can sign up for cool outreach events and opportunities to volunteer with our group. I encourage all of you to do that. We've got a couple of events coming up. So we've got our next landowner workshop at Mammon Family Library on March 24th. That event is going to be focused on landowners with smaller acreage that are interested in conservation easement. My friend Clay from Green Spaces Alliance will be our speaker for that event. It's on our website. You can RSVP there. We've also got our next Children in Nature meeting on April 29th out at Bamberger Ranch. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you've never been to Bamberger Ranch, it's absolutely gorgeous, and you should come out and check it out with us. We've got another landowner workshop on April 30th at Dry Comal Creek Vineyards. So if you want to get some wine, you want to hang out, learn about conservation easements, you can there. And then we've got our next community program on May 12th with Gary Merritt from the Great Springs Project. So that's going to be really exciting. Now I have an impossible task. I have to introduce you to someone I admire so very much. Dr. Andrew Sansom. Round of applause for this man. I can say it, no one has done more to influence my career and my professional development over the years. And he has done so for thousands of young professionals coming up the ranks in the conservation world. He's an absolute hero. And I could read a lot of the different things that I have on my sheet, which I probably should. Well, he did a couple of things before he came here today. He added over 500,000 acres of public land holdings in Texas. Notable additions include Big Bend Ranch State Park, Matagorda Island, and Guadalupe River State Park. Just a little bit, small ones. Yeah, absolutely. He also founded the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation, which is pretty cool. It accepts philanthropic gifts for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. On behalf of Texas, he acquired the last remaining native bison herd, which now resides at Caprock Canyon State Park. And during his time at Texas Parks and Wildlife, he initiated an aggressive program to introduce urban children to nature and the outdoors, resulting in the creation of the Texas Children in Nature Network and the Texas Outdoor Family Program, which was a program I got to be a part of. I was a ranger that went around all over the state introducing families to go camping. And so there are just so many things that I could say about Andy. He's a true friend, a mentor, someone I deeply admire. Round of applause, and let's listen to what he has to say.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank all of you for having me tonight. Ryan has just showed you that he possesses the most important attribute of the politician, and that is in that exaggerated introduction, he was able to make things sound better than they actually are, which always reminds me of a man who was trying to get some insurance for his family. And he got to the part on the form where he had to say what had happened to his parents. Well, the problem was his father had been hanged. So in order to make things sound better than they actually were, he wrote on the form that his father had died at the age of 65 while participating in a public ceremony when the platform collapsed. I am so proud of Ryan and grateful to all of you. There's no place, very few places in the United States that are under as much pressure as we are here in the Near Hill Country in the corridor. And so for you guys to have come on the scene and doing so well, people far beyond you are extremely grateful for what you're doing here. And I'm just honored to be with you. I grew up on the coast, south of Houston on the Brazos, and the hill country was legendary. I mean, we spent all of the school year dreaming about getting over here in the summers and swimming in the springs and going to Ocarina and being in the hill country. And so that's part of what I think inspired me to get into the business that I've been in for the last 50 years or so. For those experiences that I had as a child in the hill country. On the other hand, just to show you how naive I was, I figured when I got out of school that the answer to all the nation's problems were in Washington, D.C. So I went there as fast as I could. My wife and I moved to Washington in 1968. And at that time, thankfully there's some other folks here that have the same color of hair as I do, because you'll remember that at that time there were thousands of kids on the mall every single weekend protesting the Vietnam War, launching the modern environmental movement, continuing to argue for civil rights. And Nixon had appointed the governor of Alaska, whose name was Walter Hickel, to be Secretary of Interior. And the Secretary's office looks out on the mall. And so every day or weekend, Hickel would see these thousands of kids out there. And he wrote a letter to Nixon recommending, and by the way, just so we keep the record straight, most of our environmental legislation that we depend on today was passed during that administration. So anyway, Hickel writes a letter to President Nixon recommending that they sit down and listen to the youth of America. He did not recommend that they do what they say, but simply that they listen. And he made a really stupid political blunder in that he released the letter. And so Nixon fired him almost immediately. And he appointed a spectacular man whose name was Rogers Morton to be the Secretary of Interior. Mr. Morton was a congressman from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. He was an heir to the Pillsbury fortune. He was 6'8". He was a very imposing and charismatic individual. He was a good person. And somewhere along the line, he read something that I had written. I was not a major figure in that movement at that time, but I wrote op-ed pieces and stuff like that. And apparently Secretary Morton saw something I had written, because I got a call saying the Secretary of Interior wants to see you. Well, I was 26, and I mean, it kind of threw me off, but I got a haircut and showed up in his office. He engaged me in a conversation about my views about the environment, some of which he agreed with and some of which he didn't. But all of a sudden, in the middle of this conversation, it was obvious that he had other things to do. So he says to me, I have to give the commencement address at the University of Maryland tomorrow night. You can write the speech. And I went upstairs, and there were administrative staff crawling on the floor, cutting up press releases and pasting them to create his speeches. He had no speechwriter. And so I said, well, I've never written a speech, but I'll give it a try. So I called my wife and I said, no, I can't come home. I'm going to write a speech for the secretary. And so I stayed up in the Interior Department and I wrote the speech, went home, took a shower, and met him in the morning and handed him the draft, which he marked up, and I went upstairs and typed up a clean copy, and he gave the speech at the University of Maryland, and I went to work as a speechwriter on Monday morning. I didn't last very long, because I was always trying to get my views into his speeches, which weren't always consistent with those of the administration. But we became very close, and I was close to him until he passed away, and to his wife 30 years after that. But I couldn't write the speeches anymore, so he assigned me special projects. I worked on projects in Alaska. I worked on projects in Puerto Rico. I worked on the Big Thicket, which was a contemporary issue in Congress at that time. And there was an absolutely wonderful man who many of you will remember, whose name was Bob Armstrong. And Bob was elected land commissioner in Texas. And I was so desperate for news from home that when Texas Monthly first was published, you couldn't subscribe to it. The only way you could get it was on the newsstand. So I remember every month I would go down to the newsstand at the Treasury Department and buy my Texas Monthly. And I read in it one month that Bob Armstrong, a conservationist, had been elected land commissioner. Well, I couldn't believe it, so I called him and I said, Commissioner, I'm so thrilled that you've been elected and I'm in the Interior Department, and if there's anything I can do to help you or support you, all you got to do is let me know. Well, 2 months later, he showed up in my office. He had begun efforts in 1972 to acquire and protect the Big Bend Ranch between Presidio and Lajitas along the Rio Grande. Well, at that time, I had never heard of it. I'd never been to Big Bend. And that ranch has about 37 miles of Rio Grande frontage. It has 2 of the highest waterfalls in Texas. It has an entire volcanic crater. But all he could talk about was the night sky. What seeing the Milky Way and the stars were like in Big Bend. Well, anyway, the other thing Bob did was Texas has more tidelands offshore than any other state, because we negotiated, I think it's about 9 nautical miles, because we came in as an independent nation. And so then, curiously, Texas had not leased any of that for oil and gas development. And so Bob was the first person to begin to lease offshore oil tracts off the Texas coast. And the major area that it had been up for lease was off Matagorda Island, which is basically between Rockport and the mouth of the Colorado River almost. And so that leasing activity sent 2 institutions through the roof. One was the Pentagon, because at that time, Matagorda Island was a base of the Strategic Air Command. It was off limits. You couldn't go there. And so the Defense Department screamed that, it would threaten the security of the United States if they released oil and gas off of the island. The other entity was the Ottoman Society, because Matagorda has much of the wintering area of the whooping crane. So Interior was under intense pressure because of its responsibility for wildlife, particularly endangered species. And so he called me into his office and he said, "What do you know about this place?" Well, it was off limits. But back in the early 70s and late 60s, the University of Texas had done a series of studies on natural areas in Texas, and Matagorda was one of them. And I had read it, so I knew enough to sound intelligent. And he said, "I want you to go down there and perform an analysis of the situation write a report, and give me your recommendations as to what our position ought to be. Well, the Air Force was not happy that I was going down there, but they couldn't really tell another cabinet officer no. So I landed on Matagorda Island in 1972, and the day I arrived, a plane load of generals flew in from Vietnam to hunt white-tailed deer and quail. They were scoring the bombing of B-52s with radar. They had big radar screens on the ground, so they weren't dropping live ordnance. So basically, it had become a recreation area for senior officials of the military. So I wrote it up, and I stayed there several days and documented my study and recommended that the base be closed and become a national wildlife refuge. Well, Mr. Morton agreed with me, and we thought we had it because at that time the Secretary of Defense was a bird watcher. His name was James Schlesinger, and he was very well known as a birder. Well, I delivered the letter to the Pentagon on Wednesday before Thanksgiving in 1972, and we didn't hear a thing. Not even a response. So, just before Christmas, I leaked the report to the Audubon Society. And within 24 hours, I get a call from 60 Minutes. And I'm going, oh, God. So I refused to talk to them. But they did the story over the Christmas holidays based on the report. At the time, I was living out in Virginia, and I rode to work every day on the bus, and I would stop at the newsstand and buy my Washington Post and get on the bus and read the Post on the way into work. And I opened up the paper, and the full bottom fold was a photograph of the whooping cranes. And I remember thinking, wow. But then I'm doomed. Sure enough, I lasted about 2 months and was no longer an employee of the Interior Department. And I could not go back to work until Ford became president. Once again, many of you here would remember the energy crisis of the 1970s. We had a major effort to get people to conserve energy across the country because of the Arab oil embargo. And I was responsible for a program which the slogan was "Don't be foolish," which was set up to get people to conserve energy. And that provided me with an opportunity to come back to Texas, which I was desperate to come home and work at the University of Houston in what was at that time called the Energy Institute. But as quickly as I could, I went to work back in the conservation field for the Nature Conservancy, which at that time was located above a pornography shop in Austin, down on 6th Street. It had probably 35 people that were giving it $100 or more. And because I was so anxious to get back into the movement, I didn't do my homework. And so the first day of work, I was informed that we were $3.5 million in debt in 1982. The Conservancy in Texas had been encouraged by the national organization to borrow about $4.5 million, of which Exxon put up the first million, which was one of the reasons they were encouraged to do it, to buy a place called Honey Creek, which I'm sure many of you have been to. It is one of the most beautiful places in the United States. But we were in danger of losing it because they couldn't repay the loan. And so I've always been more lucky than good because I found out that, number one, Texas legislature had passed a law requiring people who hunted waterfowl to buy stamps to fund wetlands preservation. So we called it the duck stamp, and the duck stamp had been on the books for several years, and they hadn't bought a thing. And so the hunters across the state, hunter organizations, were really furious that they had been paying for these stamps, but yet there was no action. Well, at that time, a group of oil and gas companies had decided to build an offshore oil port called a super port, basically off the mouth of the Brazos, and then pipe the crude oil in to the mainland, where they were going to build a huge tank farm and then distribute it across the United States. Well, the site was one of the original properties of Stephen F. Austin's family, called Peach Point. It was about 9,000 acres of wetlands, and the project failed for economic reasons. It just didn't make sense. So all of a sudden, once again, being in the right place at the right time, the purchase of the property had been probably, I don't know, $3 or $4 million. But by the time they decided they wanted to do something with it other than a tank farm, the price had accelerated so that it was worth like $6 million. And by the way, the same thing had happened at Honey Creek. Even though there was a $3.5 million debt at Honey Creek, it had appreciated to the extent that it was worth twice that. So I went to Parks and Wildlife and I said, here's the deal. I will find you one of the most beautiful wetlands in Texas for about half what it's worth. You can donate the rest of the value, and write it off, but I'm not going to do it unless you take Honey Creek. And so what the department agreed to do was to pay us a total of about $7 million for nearly $14 million worth of land, including Honey Creek. And so fairly soon after that, the legislature, many of you I'm sure know that we have a really good procedure in our legislature called sunset. And what sunset is that every decade or so, the state agencies are reviewed completely from the ground up to determine whether or not they're still relevant. And it's a time when major reforms can be made in the legislative process. Well, Parks and Wildlife was up for sunset right about this time. And it's hard to look back and remember this, but this was in 85. The last time Texas had passed a bond issue for the purchase of parks was when John Connally was governor. This was in 85. It had been $75 million, which in those days was huge. But by 1985, 20 years after Connally was gone, they still had $25 million left. So basically, Parks and Wildlife hired me to be the Century 21 of the department because they had no real formal land acquisition program. And I had been basically helping them with acquisition through the Nature Conservancy, and so they hired me. Well, once again, it's better to be lucky than good, because the other thing that happened, in addition to having a budget of $25 million, which in 1985 was a lot of money, we hit the savings and loan crisis. And so all of a sudden, every ranch in Texas was for sale. So as Ryan told you, that's the only way I was able to go through $25 million in 2.5 years and buy well over 500,000 acres of land. And they made me the executive director. Clements was governor. In those days, sadly, as in my view, what we see today, governors only served for 2 terms, and it was voluntary, but it was traditional. You served 2 terms, and then you stepped down. And so the boards that ran our state agencies in those days were bipartisan, because there'd be a Democrat elected and a Republican elected. And so, for example, my board had 9 members, some of whom were Republican and some were Democrat. And what that results in, they got to work together. And the politics is not really as much of a factor in those days. In fact, we were the envy of state agencies all over the country, because many of the states that was not true. So anyway, about 3 months into my job, Ann Richards was elected governor. for me, it was like mortar shells breaking around me because everyone expected Clayton Williams to be elected. They even knew that they were publicly saying who was going to be appointed to the Parks and Wildlife Commission. And lo and behold, he was defeated. Well, she was the state treasurer, and about the first week of December, well before she was inaugurated, one of her major donors and supporters was a plaintiff's attorney from Beaumont named Walter Humphrey. And Mr. Humphrey got some terrible political advice, and he basically announced that not only was she going to appoint him to the Parks and Wildlife Commission, but he was going to be the chairman. Well, in those days, there were outdoor writers in every newspaper in Texas, and they were on the sports page, and they were the ones that covered us. And after that announcement, there were stories all over Texas that said Richards is going to appoint a game violator to Parks and Wildlife, because they had discovered that Mr. Humphrey had shot too many geese when he was 16 or something. And so that was the headlines. So the secretary, and once again, that's what I'm telling you, it felt like mortar shells. And so I'm on the job 3 months. The secretary comes in and said, Governor-elect Richards wants you in her office in the morning. So I go over to the Treasury Department. She came out to the reception desk, took me into her office. It was just the two of us, nobody else. And she said, my daddy taught me to run the trot line on the Brazos when I was 12 years old. She said, there's nothing I like more than fishing for redfish off South Padre Island and floating the Rio Grande through Big Bend National Park. I'm thinking, this is going really well. She said, from everything I've heard about you, you're doing exactly what I would want you to do over there. But, and I'm going, okay, here it comes. She said, it's come to my attention that some of the staff, which at the time I thought maybe meant me, is making trouble for one of my appointees. She said, listen, here's the way this is going to work. Appointing those commissioners is my responsibility, and running that department is your responsibility. Here's the way this is going to work. I'll stay out of your business, and you stay out of mine. I called Nona and I said, that's the best meeting I ever had with the supervisor. So, fast forward 3 months, her first 3 commissioners come to the board. She appointed Mr. Humphrey. She appointed the mayor of Brownsville, whose name was Ignacio Garza. Absolutely, he was the first mayor ever to endorse Ann Richards. And she appointed a spectacular woman from Houston named Perry Hershey. Mrs. Hershey is the person who saved Buffalo Bio from being lined with cement. And she worked with then freshman Congressman George H.W. Bush to pull the money from the Corps of Engineers and prohibit Buffalo Bio from being channelized and lined with cement. Apparently, Congressman Bush appeared before the Appropriations Committee and said, we want you to take the money back. And they said, Congressman, you're new up here. We come up here to get money. And he said, nope, we don't want it. So anyway, Terry was an urban park person. She was very involved with urban parks across the United States. And she had absolutely no idea of the whole hunting and fishing side of the agency. She didn't know it was there. And this was her first meeting. Well, the meeting in March is the meeting where we set all the rules for fishing and hunting. And the way that works is the first day, biologists would come in from all over the state and talk about the white-tailed deer population in the piney woods or the quail population in the panhandle or whatever in order to make recommendations as to what the bag limits and the season date should be. Well, put yourself back to 91. There was no PowerPoint. There were no cell phones. The outdoor riders sat on the front row in the commission room. And so after this long day of biologists coming in order to show that the white-tailed deer population in southeast Texas was healthy or something, they would show a slide with like 50 dead deer hanging in a processing house. Well, the chairman of the commission allowed each of the commissioners to comment. And when it got to Mrs. Hershey, she said, "I think I'm going to throw up." She said, "I thought we were supposed to save these animals, not kill them all." Well, the outdoor riders leaped to their feet. They raced out into the hall, got on the payphones and filed their stories. And the next day, the papers all over the state said, "Richards appoints anti-hunter to Parks and Wildlife."
Oh,
This time she called me directly. Secretary comes in, she said, "Governor Richards is on the phone." So I picked up the phone. I said, "Good morning, Governor." She says, "Andy, what are we going to do about Terry Hershey?" I said, "Governor, you told me appointing the commissioners was your responsibility." She laughed. She laughed. She was an absolutely sensational person. And so we worked together to make sure that people understood that every member of that board supported responsible wildlife conservation. Terry became one of the most influential members of the commission that ever served on it. She is the person who finally got state government, particularly that commission, to understand that conservation easements were a method of protecting private lands and keeping landowners on their property. And it would not have happened without her. So anyway, I grew up in a hurry. I've probably been on that job six weeks when that top game warden came in my office and said, "One of our game wardens has shot and killed a man in East Texas, and we're waiting for your instructions." I had the superintendent of state parks come in my office and said, "The superintendent of our Sam Bell Maxey House, which is a historic home in Paris that we manage, has been arrested for molesting a high school girl. What do we do?" I said, "Well," I called in the head game warden and I said, "What is your recommendation?" He said, "Well, we have a new game warden in Mount Pleasant who is a detective in the sheriff's department. And I would send him over there to look at the situation and tell him what really happened." Well, I walked in my office on Monday morning and he was sitting outside. I'd never met him, but I called him and asked him to do this. And I took him in my office and he said, he did it. And I said, called in the state park director and I said, "I want him off the payroll by close of business today." "Oh no, we can't do that. We have to set up a committee." And I said, "Nope, I don't want him working here anymore." My secretary, who I'm still close to after all these years, told me that when she graduated from high school, she went to work at Parks and Wildlife about a month after graduation, and she went home crying every day because of the way women were treated in the department. And yet she'd made it there 40 years, and I attended her retirement, and by that time, she was one of the senior women in the department. Apparently her mom had said, "Suck it up. That's the way it is." And she did. And she survived. But it was a difficult place to work, particularly for women. And I grew up in a hurry. The thing that I discovered very quickly was that the biggest issue we face, not only in state parks, but across the board, is spelled M-O-N-E-Y. At the time, our state parks and local parks were funded by taxes on cigarettes. And the only reason that was true was because the federal government had passed under LBJ the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which provided matching funds for state and local government. But it had to be matched. And so our legislature in that time would have never passed any kind of tax that's a dedicated tax except they didn't want to leave that federal money on the table. Well, that tax was passed in the mid-'60s, and by the time I came along in the early '90s, I used to say, the good news is fewer people are smoking. Because in the lifetime of that tax, it had actually dropped by half in revenue, literally because of the decline in smoking. So I thought, well, this is easy. I'll find a friendly legislator that's willing to double it to 4 cents, because it was 2 pennies per pack, and I'll at least go back to even. Well, I found a legislator that was willing to do that. He introduced the bill, and that session was the first session in which Bob Bullock served as lieutenant governor. And the Senate appropriations bill came out like 2 weeks into this session, and my 2 pennies were gone. We'd gone to 0. So I spent the whole first 3 months of the legislature trying to figure out how to get the 2 pennies back. And at that time, the chairman of the Finance Committee was a really wonderful public leader. His name was John Monford. And Senator Monford called me in and he said, there's only one person that you can talk to about this. So I get an appointment with Governor Bullock. I go in his office. I'd never met him. He had his feet up on the desk. He's chain smoking. He said, 125 quail in one day. And I thought, in retrospect, that was to throw me off. And he said, what do you want? He blows a big puff of smoke in my face. And I said, Governor, I'm here to see what I can do to get the cigarette tax restored. He said, we're not spending any of that money on parks. We're going to spend it on cancer research. I thought, well, that makes sense to me, but I can't go cold turkey all at once. He said, you're not listening to me. No more cigarette money for parks. I said, well, what are my alternatives? And he took a huge drag on his cigarette. He blew the smoke in my face, and he said, suicide. And he turned around and started talking to the staff. And I was excused. Well, the next day, I had probably 50 people show up at the hearing to try to get it restored. And Monford comes in and gavels the hearing open, and he said, issue number 1, cigarette tax restored. Boom. So the lesson was, you don't ever come up here and talk about money unless you get my support. And I learned the lesson. And the next session, Bullock became the person who enabled us to transfer that method of financing from taxes on cigarettes to that portion of your sales tax which is collected on sporting goods. It's the only dedication of the sales tax that exists, and it's for Parks and Wildlife from sporting goods. And it would not have happened without Bullock. Bullock was, in many ways, a bizarre character, but he had the best interests of the state at heart, and he was unbelievably powerful. In those days, we clearly believed that the lieutenant governor was the most powerful politician in the state. Well, I served there for 12 years, and I made a decision every day that made somebody happy and somebody mad. And I learned that it was the mad ones that accumulate. And so I was in a hearing, an appropriations hearing, in the spring of 2001, and they just tore me up. I mean, it was brutal. And at that time, the president of then Southwest Texas was named Jerry Supple. And Dr. Supple was up in the afternoon. And so he was sitting in the back just to kind of get their temperature. And so I staggered out of the hearing, and he followed me out in the hall, and he said, if you ever get tired of this, you can come down to Southwest Texas. And we had worked together, as Diane Washington remembers, we had worked together to acquire the amusement park which at one time was the most visited amusement park in the state until things like SeaWorld and Six Flags came along. And so he and I had a really good relationship. He was harsh. Dan will remember that he was harshly criticized for acquiring it because you couldn't put a dorm on it. You couldn't build a football stadium or a classroom building on it. And so no one could figure out why in the world he did it. And the community thought it was their primary economic engine when in fact more people would go to the outlet malls in San Marcos every month than went to Ocarina in a year. But he did it anyway. And I went home and I thought about it, and about October I called him up and I said, okay, let's talk. So I went to work for now Texas State in February of 2002. And I cannot tell you what a wonderful experience being there has been. Not only because of what has happened there, but I would go in and walk up the steps to the old Ocarina Springs Inn, which is where my office was, and pinch myself every day that I got to look out on those springs when I went to work. My office was in the corner of the building looking right out on the lake, and there was a public sidewalk outside, and it was the honeymoon suite of the old Ocarina Springs Inn. And I'd be sitting there at my computer, and I'd look around, and I don't use the word elderly anymore, but there'd be a couple peering in the window. And so I'd go out on the pavement to meet them, and they'd say, yeah, we stayed here in 1947. So it was just an incredible privilege, and to work with people like Steph here on the front row and others over the years has been, I'm sure, the greatest privilege of my life. But I was able to concentrate on what I consider to be the major conservation problems facing the state. Texas is 95% privately owned. That means all of our watersheds, all of our aquifer recharge areas are on private property. I've told you that I spent a whole bunch of the 80s buying land for parks and wildlife refuges. And I hope that when they push me in the crematorium, I've got a deed for another state park. But we cannot buy enough land to solve these problems. We have to find ways to keep landowners on the land and doing the right thing. The biggest terrestrial issue that we face is the continued fragmentation of family land. And it has everything to do with our water situation. Quite honestly, it's incredibly disappointing to me that, and I was in favor of it, I argued strongly that we passed this big water funding. But the legislature refused to allow any of that funding for what we call natural or green infrastructure, which is a critical part of our water situation. If we don't protect those aquifers, recharge areas, and watersheds, it doesn't matter how many miles of pipeline we fund or treatment system. So the second issue there for me is we treat groundwater and surface water as if they're different substances. Think about the Blanco. Blanco starts out where Tom is, out toward Kendall County. It flows southeastward toward Hays County. And before it gets to Hays County, most of it goes back in the ground. It flows underground and comes back up at a place where I know many of you have been, called Jacob's Well. And it flows down Cypress Creek through Wimberley and back in the Blanco. If you try to get a water rights permit from the Blanco, you couldn't get it because it's already overcommitted. But if you want to go up above Jacob's Well and drill a hole in the ground, you can pump just about as much of it as you're man or woman enough to pump without hardly any regulation. And it's the same water. And that is completely unsustainable. Thankfully, these big water transfers that we've been reading about, particularly now from East Texas, have got the legislators' attention. And I think we're going to see I'm guessing that the reason why we haven't seen any interim charges yet is because they're waiting until these runoffs are over. They don't want to, complicate the runoffs, because we haven't seen any of the interim charges, but I'm fairly certain we're going to have one on groundwater. I don't believe that we're going to eliminate the rule of capture, but I think that we're hearing more and more talk of using a system of correlative rights, which is how we protect neighbors in oil and gas situations. And we have for 100 years. And so, in my mind, the most likely reform, and hopefully they'll do it, would be to authorize a system of correlative rights so that people do not damage their neighbor by selling all the water that they can pump out from underneath. In 2008, after I had moved to Texas State, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the acquisition of Big Bend Ranch. Bob Armstrong is still alive. He's no longer with us, but he was. He was appointed to the Parks and Wildlife Commission by Mark White and made the motion to acquire the ranch. It was a big enough event in my life that we got all our children and at that time one grandchild to come, and we all met out at the ranch, and it was wonderful. We had some buffalo soldiers and cowboys, and my grandson was 5. He was about this tall. He graduated from Rice in 2 months, but in those days he was 5 years old, and we couldn't tell when the whole thing, how it affected him, because I've got pictures of him sitting on the lap of a buffalo soldier or throwing a horseshoe with the cowboy. But he goes back to New Jersey in the New York suburbs where he lived and find them to select an animal that migrates, draw a picture of it, and tell where it would migrate to and why. Well, he picks an eagle. And the E's this big and the G's upside down, and you wouldn't know from the picture what it was. You'd have to be told. But he says that he would migrate to Texas so he could go out to Big Bend and see the stars. When we first began and one of the reasons I've appreciated what Ryan Spencer has done so much over the past 20 years is that back in the early 90s, we began to understand that at that time, the outdoors was largely a province of affluent Anglo men, particularly in hunting and fishing. And so we began efforts to try to figure out a way to get new people into the conservation movement. We formed a relationship with an African-American church in East Austin to take their kids hunting and hiking and fishing and bird watching. And I remember one year we took those children up to the Lampasas on a canoe trip. Well, most of them had not only never been on a canoe, but they'd never been out of Travis County. But we had really good adult leaders. And so they taught these kids how to canoe. And within a couple hours, you'd have thought they'd been in canoes all their lives. We canoed down the Lampasas. Took about 6 hours. And when we got to the point where we were getting out, one of the adult leaders was standing up on the sandbar, skipping rocks. And this child in my canoe said, "Did you see what that dude did?" And we realized that these children had never seen anyone skip a rock. So we got them out on the sandbars, and for the next 2 hours, we taught them how to skip rocks. And that night, all the adult leaders, both black and white, were sitting around the campfire telling stories. And the children were back down on the river in the pitch black dark, skipping rocks. No matter what we do, we're attorneys or accountants or school teachers or housewives, people ask me all the time, what can I do to help solve all these problems? every one of us can find a way to take a kid outdoors, put them in the water, have them understand that being outdoors is fun, that it's spiritually important, that it's good for mental health, but it's not going to be there unless they take responsibility for it. So thank you all very much for having me.
You can all see why Andy is an incredible human being. Glad he's here. I think we can take a few questions if you guys have them. If you want to raise your hand, I'll bring the mic over to you so everybody online and whatnot can hear. Come on over to Andy. There you go.
So as everybody knows, right now we're in a drought. And is it a drought of record or what? One time I heard you talk about our perception of the droughts we've had versus everyone's perception of the drought in the 50s. Could you say something about that?
Historically, the question is, what is this as bad as it's ever going to get? Well, historically, water planning in Texas, which, by the way, is a model for the rest of the United States in many respects, is based on the principle that the drought that existed between 1947 and 1957 was the worst it's ever going to get. And it's identified as a drought of record. Well, my feeling, and the people that I talk to every day, is that there is a firm belief that this is going to exceed and already has the drought of record. And I fully imagine that soon we'll be seeing that in the documentation. It's bad. And the only good thing I can say about it is our legislature doesn't do anything hard unless it really gets bad. And so it may be that this finally brings them to the point where they bring some reasonable reforms to this situation.
So why do you think everyone, one time you said you thought that everybody thinks the drought in the 50s was so much worse was because everyone still had someone, an aunt or uncle, someone still lived back on the farm.
There's no question about that. There was and I don't want to bore you all, but there was a great state senator that I got to know pretty well named Bill Sims. Sims was from San Angelo. He was so conservative that he opposed every acquisition of public land. He actually had a heart attack of some kind, and he was in the hospital, and I became pretty good friends with him. I mean, you can be friends with people that don't agree with you. And so I called his wife, who was in the hospital, and I said, "How's he doing?" He said, "Well, he's hanging in there." I said, "Well, tell him I'm fixing to buy another park, and that'll get him out of there." Anyway, Bill Sims grew up with a very, very famous Texas Western writer whose name is Elmer Kelton. Kelton was nominated or named by the Outdoor Western Writers of America as the finest Western writer in the country. And if you've never read it, you should find a copy of The Time It Never Rained. It's the absolute best thing you can read about the drought of the 1950s. And I asked Senator Sims, I said, because he grew up with Elmer Kelton, I mean, since second grade. I said, "Have you read The Time It Never Rained?" And Senator Sims said to me, "I've read every book that Elmer has written except that one because I can't." And so, directly to your question, I think that's exactly right. That people were on the land, most people were rural, and so the drought was up close and personal. And I think part of the problem we face today is that as long as people turn on the tap and water comes out, they think everything's okay. And that was not true in the 50s.
How many people realize this is a year without blue bonds?
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't think about it. It's like, but we should be seeing a lot. I haven't seen it.
I know.
It didn't rain in October, November.
Yeah.
It's a year without blue bonds.
Well, I think that it's there's no question that even though most of us are urban in nature, that everyone is feeling the results of it, particularly in things like not having the wildflowers that were so precious to us.
Andy, my understanding from your mentee over here, Ryan, is that you live and work on the Hershey Ranch,
Yes, sir.
and it has become celebrated in a very special way. Tell us some of what's happened to bring about the extraordinary recognition.
Well, I do have the privilege of living on the Hershey Ranch. Mrs. Hershey, with whom I became very, very close, left me a life estate on the ranch, and so it will be mine until my death. Mrs. Hershey was well into her 90s, unable really to manage, and so the ranch became very, very seriously overgrazed. And so when Nona and I became responsible for it, basically 2011, we took the cattle off of it completely. We began to burn it. We converted all the cultivated grass pastures to native flowers and grasses. We used what is called a regenerative grazing process, using electric fences and very few cattle to mimic bison. So they hit it hard and then we move them very quickly. So we still use cattle, which we had kept off of it for 10 years. But it's for habitat management rather than income. It simply does not pay for itself, but it helps us manage the habitat, particularly because we've been unable to burn for the last 4 or 5 years. Thanks to Ryan, we have 2 youth hunts. We do manage our white-tailed deer population. Most of it is harvested by kids that Ryan and his colleagues bring out there. We have 2 hunts for adult women who have never hunted, and those are really, really moving. Most of them, we started that with women who worked in conservation organizations but had never hunted. And all the guides are women. There's a butcher that shows them how to process the deer that is a woman. And there's a chef that shows them how to cook it. So it's a real privilege, and I appreciate you, Frank, asking that question. I'm a fortunate person.
And Tom and I are from Bertie. We represent the Cibolo Center for Conservation. So I'm curious about the 2 organizations, Comal Conservation, us. You've encouraged us to get children in nature, which we do. What else can we do? We've got to name conservation.
Well, one of the reforms I think that has come about in that movement, and Ryan was part of it, is we learned very early that you can take a child, a boy or a girl, and get them interested in hunting or fishing or bird watching or rock climbing or whatever. But if the parents don't get into it, you may never see them again. And so for me, the transformational move in Children in Nature was to begin to involve families. The Parks and Wildlife set up the Families in Nature. There's an absolutely spectacular organization called Families in Nature, or FIN, which they have what they call a gear library. So you can go check out tents and sleeping bags and cooking gear and take them away, take them for the weekend, and they'll train you. So for me, that, getting whole families into the deal has been one of the biggest changes that we've been able to make. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I found disappointed is when I was growing up, 4-H was very involved with ecology and nature and things like that, even from the ranching side. But when my husband died almost 5 years ago, I contacted 4-H because I'd been in 4-H for 9 years to see how I could protect my ranch but start to get kids involved. Talked to our local county extension agent or AgriLife agent. And the first time he said, yeah, I'll look into it. Next time he said, yeah, I got a guy that is wanting to start some projects. Third time he finally admitted to me that the only project they were looking at was outdoor hunting. And I was very disappointed because I thought, yeah, outdoor hunting is nice, but you're just teaching them this much of the whole scheme. You're not talking about the life of the deer, you're not talking about the wildlife, you're not talking about the ecosystem. And so I've written 4-H up and I'm looking at all these other groups to start, once I get my conservation easement, to start getting kids to come. But it just broke my heart because I had spent 9 years in 4-H. I grew up here in the Broncos, and 4-H was one of my outlets to be able to learn about the birds, the wildlife, the grasses, the reptiles, the amphibians. You know, and for them to just wipe that off the map, especially since A&M oversees AgriLife, I just found that so disconcerting.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. There's no bad way to use the outdoors. And, there's no bad activity.
Right.
And so I couldn't agree more. I think that our activities for children and families need to be diversified across the spectrum of outdoor experience.
I think we got time for one more question. Has anybody got anything they want to say, want to ask? We got one?
I'll ask a question. I'm very curious, when you had the kids out skipping rocks and canoeing, did they all have tendonitis the next day and couldn't paddle their canoes?
No, but I'll tell you the most wonderful sequel to that story. That church bought a camp. And they have for the last 30 years taken kids to their own camp. Frank and I and others are working together. One of the issues that I have been trying to spend time on at this point in my life is to help save these faith-based camps. Because like Boy Scout camps and everything else, there's a crisis underway. And we need to save them. Not only for their environmental values, but for what they provide for kids. My first experience is outdoors were at church camp.
Thank you. A round of applause for Andy. Andy, I know you have pretty much all of our swag, but I got you our new Dark Skies bandana and our new Worst Best pen. Thank you for being here. Well, you know, every time I listen to Andy talk, I learn something new. And it reminds me of the very first time I ever really got invited to spend any time with Andy. He was talking a little bit about writing a speech. You know, it was the department in Washington, writing a speech late in the evening. And I remember we were in a class. I was working on my master's degree at the time. We had a professor named Richard Earl who was having us draw maps by hand and use transits and all this other stuff. And it was a very challenging class. And we were partnered up on a project together, and it went okay, as good as it could for a Richard Earl project. And he asked me, he was like, Ryan, would you drive me down to Weslaco? I've got to give a speech at the World Birding Center. They're going to open it, and you drive, and I'll write the remarks as we go down the road. And so we get down there, and Andy crushes it, hits it out of the park. The birding center is open, and everything's great. And I'm like distracted because I'm a young conservationist. Like, he bought Big Bend Ranch. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm here. I'm driving the Prius, and I'm not looking at the gas gauge very much. All right, and so we managed somehow to coast into a Valero in Three Rivers, and ever since then we've kind of been like this. And talking about the most powerful moments in conservation for me, it's always centered around connecting kids with the outdoors. And in almost every stage of my professional career, Andy has been there in some form or capacity, in an introduction or an email or a phone call. And I remember I got a job at West Cave Outdoor Discovery Center, in part because Andy knew the folks at West Cave. whatnot. And I was working real hard because I wanted to impress. And I worked every day in September. And I was doing a star party. And we had all the telescopes out there in the parking lot, and all the kids were looking through the scopes. And I was beat. I'd worked every day that month. And I just hear out in the darkness from this little girl, "That's the coolest thing I've ever seen." And I'll just never forget it, because when we think about those big three issues for the environment, land fragmentation, water availability, and children in nature, it just screams to me it's something that we can really do. And so I'll share with you one of the things I do as an executive director. I give my board a book every year, one book to help them understand where we're going for the year. And we've read a lot of different ones. The Nature of Oaks by Doug Talmy, and we've read Saving Us by Catherine Hayhoe, and we even read Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. This year, we're reading Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. And I don't know, how many of you read this book? Raise your hand if you read it. It's phenomenal. It might be the best conservation book I've ever read. And I actually highlighted a passage. I really hope I can flip to it fast enough, because you know how that goes. You should get this book, and you can follow along with the board for our journey through the year. Rich says this: "Passion is lifted from the earth itself by the muddy hands of the young. It travels along grass-stained sleeves to the heart. If we're going to save environmentalism and the environment, we must also save the endangered indicator species, the child in nature." So, phenomenal book. I encourage all of you to read it. I know Andy's going to stick around for a little bit, answer questions and whatnot. We got plenty of awesome merch in the back. And for everybody that's here, thank you so much for being here tonight. It really means the world to me and to my board and to everyone. Also, I've got a ton of food in the back. So please, thank you, Leslie. Grab the food, and we'll see you next time. All right. Thank you very much.